Okay, so welcome to the last panel of the day. Thanks to everyone for staying after lunch. It's a very impressive afternoon crowd. I'm Sarah Boylan. I'm in Behavioral Social Sciences, and I'm really excited to introduce 3 out of what will be our 4 panelists. So next to me is Fabian Wander. He's the Director of Student Health Services. Next to Fabian is Marie Ortiz. She is an ARC Coordinator, Accessibility Resources Center. And next to her is Laura McGowan, who is our ASAP Director. Chief Bernabe will be joining us as well, but he has an emergency to take care of, and so he'll join us when he can. So what we're here to talk about today is, this is sort of a part 2. Some of you attended the colloquium in the fall of 2017. Which was entitled Keeping It Cool in the Classroom. And so one of the things that the Center for Teaching and Learning Council decided to focus on for these colloquiums is kind of like pressing issues that, not only affect faculty, but also affect staff, administrators, of course our public safety, people who are on campus, people who provide services to our students. And so we're just really excited to have you guys here. Thank you for your time. And we wanted to just kind of pick up the conversation. So, when we say things like keeping it cool in the classroom, and this is a question for the audience, what do you guys think of when you think of a cool classroom? If you're doing an observation or if you're teaching a class, kind of how would you define a cool classroom?
A classroom where everyone is engaged in the same task.
A sense of connection, that you're really a part of a community that's working on whatever you're doing in the class, the assigned task.
That's great, right? And I think we heard a lot of examples throughout the day, right? So we heard Professor DeSanto talking about this moment where, she was asked a question that kind of made her step back for that second, right? And I think we've all been there, regardless of what the question is or what our identity is. But how do we respond in that moment, and how do we create teaching moments out of those things? And I think she really gave us a lot of great tips, as well as some of the other folks, right? If we think about calling students by name, having an atmosphere where they know us and we know them. Some faculty in the room do a lot of student conferencing during the class. So some things like that can kind of create that environment. So now we're going to turn it over to our panel of experts, and they're going to just give you, we're going to start out with kind of a lightning panel approach. So we were 5 and now we're 3, so it'll be really lightning. Maybe we'll finish a few minutes early. But we're going to start out by having the panelists talk about what they do upon first encounter. So they meet students often in a different way than we meet them in the classroom. And so they're going to share some strategies or some best practices about sort of that first encounter and what they do to set the tone. We could just maybe go down the row.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so a little sad there wasn't coffee to keep everyone awake. But so I ran up to Duncan really quick, got a little energy. So what I like to do, so I do a lot of groups. The work that I do, I work with people individually, and I think it's important to help people feel comfortable with wherever they are, with that environment that they're in. And so I'm going to more focus, I think, on groups. What I try to instill with folks, whether it be students or clients I work with, is that this group is their group. And so that might be related to the classroom. This is their classroom, and they can really learn a lot or not learn a lot. It's really up to them. So really, it's about being inclusive and setting some. I like to start a group with ground rules. So I'll just ask the students to come up with some ideas of ground rules, and for them to agree on that. And I may throw a couple with I'm not getting that much, but I think that's important so they feel like they're part of this process of learning. Inclusivity is important. So I also ask people to learn to be aware of what you're saying, to pay attention to how other people are responding. Self-awareness is extremely, I think, helpful. And to sometimes take a deep breath if they need to, If the information is a little bit too much for them, depending on what we're discussing, and then come back to the group when they're more comfortable. But I think what's important is also when I talk about mindfulness is not to allow themselves to take over the group or the classroom, where you might have a student who kind of has a lot of energy and has a lot to say, but maybe setting up a rule, each student, you have a response, give them a certain amount of time, then move it to the next student that might have information. And I try to get as many students engaged as possible. Or in a group, you'll have students that may not, they're more introverted and they don't feel comfortable. And I really try to engage them as best as possible, from introducing themselves every time in the group, so they're saying their name. That might just kind of help just to break the ice a little bit, something about themselves, and then keep it going from there. But I think as engaged as possible, when the students are engaged, they're definitely a lot more focused in the class, and they feel like they're part of that process.
So for us, it's a little different. We take different approaches. So we are the Disability Resource Center, so we work with students who have a diagnosed disability and might need accommodations within the classroom setting. So pre-enrollment, before the students get here at hostels, we meet with the students and we talk about the resources that we offer. We educate our students. The way we do that is by letting them know that, one, their professor in our office is the first resource for them, right? The syllabus is tools, but we always remind them that regardless of disability or not, there's behavioral procedures and policies that need to be followed throughout hostels. And if they do have any sort of difficulty following that they should either speak to their professors or speak to us. So it's just a lot of just informing them of the tools that are out there for them, helping them kind of, for some of them, the stigma is still there as identifying as a student with a disability, or even letting their professors know that they're registered with ARC and have accommodations. So it's just constant communication between the student, the professor, and our office. And that's how we kind of just set the precedent for hoping that that relationship is open and it will be easier for us as a hostel community to serve our students.
Hi, everyone. So in ASAP, we basically try to build, I know this was talked about a lot earlier, about building a sense of community. All of our students have monthly groups, and it's broken down by when they entered our program. So brand new students have monthly programming. Students who have been here a year have different programming. And I would say one of the things that we talk about with students who are brand new is we show the We Are Hostos video to get them, that you're a part of this community. We also talk a lot when we first meet students about what ASAP is, the history of ASAP, to make them feel like they belong to this program. But we really emphasize, too, that students are not in high school anymore, and we really try to connect them with their goals. So the first thing that we do with them is to talk about what graduation plan are you on. This is after an icebreaker. We really try to get them to write down those goals, and we revisit them on a regular basis. So every time that a student comes in for an advisement appointment, it's like, how is that going? This is what you said. We talked about this. We try to factor in, how many children do you have, or what are your other responsibilities, and really try to make those goals as realistic as possible and then revisit them. So that's basically how we first engage with students.
We'll give Chief a second to just settle on it.
So cool here.
Thank you so much for joining us, Chief Bernabe. They were just sharing a little bit about how they approach students kind of at first contact. Yeah. And if you want to come back to that, we can move to a different question, and we can get you maybe two with one shot.
Your first contact might be a little different.
Yeah. It's different. Well, we always start off with a smile. Smile is very important.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, usually first contact with public safety is right at the door, and they're smiling and saying hi, and but we can come back to that. So we're going to ask Fabian to touch on something that I think most of us have had experience with, sort of on a spectrum, right? From kind of like little signs or little cues to like really overt signs or cues that something is maybe not right with a particular student. And so Fabian is going to share his experience kind of from the mental health side about some signs or clues that we could sort of be aware of when we're in the classroom or in the office or in the hallways that a student might need, some additional services or possibly be in distress.
So I think it's what's super important for everyone to do here, and I'm sure so many of you already do, is when you start your semester, letting your students know about all the resources that are available on campus. And I think a lot of people put that in their syllabi, and it's shared, and they read some, most students won't read those particular areas of, additional resources. So I think it's extremely important to bring that up in the beginning of the semester and then a couple times throughout the semester. And that way, you're not really singling out any student. If there are kind of needs that they might have, you're not saying, well, you need this, and they might feel uncomfortable. So I think that's always really important, because you're also defining your role as a professor in the classroom, and as not as their, whatever figure they might see you as. Because you might be a professor and a psychologist at the same time, but you're unable to provide that service in that role because you're a professor at that moment. And so I think that's important. Really let people know that we have great resources and support on campus. And you can always welcome any of us to come and speak to you and let the class know about that. So that's one aspect. And I think throughout the semester you get to know your students well. I think our students are very well connected with their professors, and they look up to them, and they always kind of speak about them. They tell them everything. Sometimes too much. I'm sure you've heard a lot, right? So what I like to do in those cases is you really know your student better than most folks on campus. And you see them, multiple times a week. And you can see changes in behavior and changes in the way they maybe dress. And you might notice some changes in attendance. And I think that's something that you should always pay attention to. And obviously you don't bring that up in the classroom, but after the class is over, you would want to sit down with them and say, I'd like to speak to you, come to my office, or whenever there's a safe space to speak, and just check in with them. Hey, I'm just checking in with you, how things going. I've noticed, blah, 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 and I'm just curious. I just want to know if you need any help with anything specific. And they may tell you, they may not, but just let them know, look, we have a lot of great resources, again, available on campus. They're free, they're confidential, and they're here to help you as part of your service fees. You're paying for this in a sense. So we really want to encourage them to use all of the support that they have on campus. But, you're going to have students that are just not comfortable with sharing any information, and that's fine. But I would just, that I think is important. So signs to look at, they might be withdrawing from the class conversation. They might, you might see some hygiene issues that pop up in the classroom. They might be showing up late frequently. And that might be many different things, right? They might have issues with childcare. And now their childcare provider isn't available till a certain time, so they're running late, and they may not want to share that. And I have these conversations with students all the time. Communicate to your professor, let them know what's going on. If they don't know, they just might think that you're not interested. So really, our faculty here, I think, are really supportive of our students when the students let them know they need help. So I always encourage that from students. And I think that there are multiple reasons that people have challenges in our college that are outside of their capability, their intellectual capability. And I think a lot of that really will trickle down into the classroom. I do a lot of work with students who have experiences with domestic violence. And you can imagine if a student had an incident at home, they show up to class on time, ready to learn, but their mind is really somewhere else. So again, just pay attention to that and really come to them in a non-judgmental manner and let them know here, if there's anything happening, please share with me. We have support for you on campus. I really want you to succeed in this classroom. I really want you to do well in college. And there's all this great help out there that you can access. I think that's really important. Creating that, the ability for them to come and engage with you. But at the same time, creating boundaries where, you don't want them to kind of tell you everything about their lives, because that's not really your role in the classroom. And it'll probably take up all your time. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Fabian. Okay, so Chief, now we're gonna get to some practices, procedures, and policies. So we're gonna ask you to share some suggestions you might have for faculty, whether it's in terms of a written policy or general procedures, things to just kind of keep the classroom cool, sort of at normal operating pace, or if something were to arise?
So I think I heard some of it as I was walking in, and I think that establishing the rules of the game are important right from the very beginning, whether you have them in your syllabi. Can everyone hear me? Whether you have them in your syllabi or you don't, or you have them on a separate piece of paper, I think it's important to establish the rules from the very beginning. And you know, you don't have to do it in a dictatorship kind of way. You can just basically introduce it, say, look, these are the rules of the game. We want to make sure that everyone is respected in the classroom. We want to make sure that we respect everyone's point of view and opinion, because a lot of the complaints we get sometimes is when people kind of get agitated in sharing opinions and other people don't particularly agree with that person's opinion, especially when it's a person who's just kind of the one or two few and everybody else is on this side of the room. So we want to make sure that everyone respects everyone's opinion, and sharing that with people is very important. We know that. And also listening to the students, right? You know, making sure that when you're talking to people that you're looking at them in the face, that you don't have your back to the board when you're talking to them. I think that's very important. I like, believe it or not, and I mean, even when I do instructional teaching with our officers, I like to kind of set up the room in a school circle. Some people might think that that's kind of childish, perhaps. Maybe you can't do it in a room like this. But when you have people sitting around looking at each other, it makes it a little more difficult for them to kind of act out, right? Because everybody's looking at them, right? Everybody's looking at everybody. It's not just the back of the head. So if you kind of have a group of people sitting around looking at each other, everybody's kind of paying attention, looking at each other, and everybody's going to see how they're behaving. But definitely establishing the rules from the very beginning, trying to avoid just having those personal discussions, as Fabian indicated. Students will try to talk to you about everything, making sure that you discuss those things privately, right, during office hours or after class or before class. And then, of course, if they share something with you that's confidential, not exposing them, right, not bringing that up, because that would be very embarrassing to them, right, in the classroom. And other people, they get their feelings hurt, I guess. Other things is that, even though you might try all these tips, sometimes confrontations do happen in the classroom. I would highly encourage all of you not to get involved in trying to break up any physical confrontation, right? And you might say, well, what should I do? My recommendation is step out of the classroom, right? And leave and go to the nearest courtesy phone or office and call. You might also want to establish or identify one or two students in your classroom at the beginning of the semester who could also call public safety for you. And you don't have to say, I need a volunteer to call public safety in case there's ever a fight in the classroom. You would say, one of the things that I do as a faculty member is, I like to identify one or two people who call public safety in case someone becomes ill in the classroom. And we want to get 911 here very quickly. So if any of you would like to volunteer, please see me after the class. And then you can tell them, this is where public safety is at, this is how you would get them. And, of course, at that point, now that you have a volunteer, you can say, I'd like, to pick on you and identify you in case there's ever a problem in the classroom also, would you go get them for us? And then this way, at the onset of any problem like that, those people would go out and no one else has to know that, right? So I think that's important as well. Don't get involved in the physical confrontation. One of the things I also like to share with faculty is, if a confrontation does happen, try to get as much details as you can as to what's happening in the classroom. And I only say that because eventually these folks will be seen by the dean of students, sometimes by public safety, and you as the faculty member in the classroom, the adult in the classroom, the person leading the classroom, it's important for us to hear what you have to tell us about whatever occurred, right? Because a lot of times they'll come and say, well, no, she started or he started, and the professor in the classroom is very important. We like to hear what happened if possible, right? So that's just some of the things I think that establishing the rules, listening to people, and also if someone is being disruptive and not paying attention and moving around, in that kind of school circle is as you're moving around the classroom. And I'm a big fan of moving around the classroom. You know, you don't have to actually tell a person, hey, you stop. You can just kind of stand next to them, and you know, you're talking to the rest of them, and then you look down and smile at that person. How about you? What do you think? You know, and just kind of just throw them completely off. You know, and some people will get it. You know, they'll recognize, oh, I guess I was being disruptive.
That's great, thank you. So another thing I think we're really grateful to have Marie on the panel today from ARC to talk a little bit about how we can address issues related to accessibility without singling a student out or exposing any confidential information. So when the student hands you that envelope and then you read it and store it in a secure place, if there are accommodations or something like, if it's an intellectual disability and they're going to have someone with them in the classroom, or if they get a note taker, or if they're recording your lectures, or all of these different levels of accommodations, Marie's going to give us some helpful tips and suggestions about how to make sure that we're following the law and giving students what they deserve to be successful, what they have a legal right to, while not creating a situation that they feel uncomfortable or that they don't want to hand you that letter in the first place,
We have many parts to this question, so I do have notes. The first that, like everyone's been emphasizing, is that the syllabus is an important tool. There should be a little statement on the syllabus that says if you have any sort of disability, you need any sort of learning adjustments, that you should contact the Accessibility Resource Center, right? So we're going into the game thinking that our students are doing that, and if they have done that, they will bring a letter to you at the beginning of the semester. The letter will clearly state the law and that the student is registered with our office and have a list of their accommodations, okay? So once the student has presented that letter to you, that's an open invitation for you to address any difficulties that you see in the classroom setting. Now, we don't do that in the classroom in front of other students, okay? The best way to do that is to ask the students to meet you either after class or during office hours. And if there are any sort of learning adjustments that are needed in the classroom and that other students have made you aware of it, like, for example, some of our students have the use of a calculator in a math class. And if there are any in-class assignments and one student is allowed a calculator and the other students aren't, they might bring that to the professor's attention. The best way to address that is to say that that student has certain modifications. If you need any modifications or have ever had any modifications, please come see me after class. You don't want to ever address the student with a disability as one having a disability, or to the Accessibility Resource Center directly to the student by saying, if you need modifications, you should go to the Accessibility Resource Center, because right there you're outing the student. The students are now aware that the student might be registered with ARC, okay? So like I said, the best way is to just address them after class or during office hours. And one more thing. It's always important, if you do have a student that you see is not registered or hasn't presented a letter, but might kind of display some sort of disability within the classroom context, you can always reach out to someone in ARC, and the best way to do that is by meeting the student after class or office hours and just making the connection, giving them an actual name of a person in the office. Like, oh, I have a friend who works over at ARC, her name is Verdi. I think she can help you kind of figure out if you need any learning adjustments. Okay?
That's great. And now we're going to move over to Laura, and we're going to save plenty of time for questions. So if anything has come up that kind of resonates with something you've been thinking about or grappling with, or that you want to elaborate on further, we should have at least 20 minutes at the end. So Laura's going to talk a little bit to us about how she works with ASAP students. They have some phenomenal workshops. I know some folks in the room have facilitated workshops or met with ASAP students. Some of us have taught ASAP classes. So Laura's going to talk a little bit about how they help ASAP students learn to read their faculty. We're all quite a varied lot, right? So, what might be okay in one class is not okay in another class. And, I think for students that can be something that leads them to feel like it's not fair, right? I can text in this class, but I can't text in your class. How come, right? Or I can come in late every day and not be penalized in this class, but you expect me, right? And so, I think they have a hard time navigating, right? Particularly if they've been out of school a long time, even coming right from high school. And so Laura's going to share with us some of the ways that they kind of work with their students to tune into not only the professor and any idiosyncrasies of a particular faculty member, but also to take ownership of their response to what's happening around them.
Basically, one of the components of the groups that I mentioned before was that we usually take some time to have brand new students meet a professor, and the professor comes in and just kind of, converses with students so that they can see that, yes, faculty members are in fact human beings. I think it's probably helpful when you're a faculty member to remember how students, they're, for the most part, many of them are young, and they look up to you, and it's pretty easy to forget how intimidating you could be as a faculty member, right, as an authority figure. And I think one of the things that we also do with students is to tell them, when they're complaining about, well, this faculty member isn't like that one. It's basically life, right? I mean, you're going to have an employer, you're not going to like this one, you're going to have a colleague that you're not going to like. These are basic life skills, and to kind of switch it around and look at things from another perspective to see, well, how can I kind of take on a challenge of, succeeding in this particular classroom that's completely the opposite of another kind of classroom where I might find it easier to succeed. I think, we talked a little bit earlier about being authentic. I think that goes a long way in terms of working with students. I've had faculty members say to me, I don't understand one class, everything is going gangbusters, they're all getting along, everybody's cooperating, we're running on all cylinders. And then another class, an hour later, is totally a dud, So maybe that goes back to really, getting back to having some sense of belonging, in the classroom, for having students to collaborate in different ways so that they do take more ownership. One of the workshops that we used to do was about victimhood. And we went through this whole, 3 or 4 sessions of what does it mean when you're a victim, and at the end somebody said, oh my God, I've been a victim my whole life, So these kinds of, you have to remember that, for the most part, students they're young, they're very hungry to learn. I think I mentioned the last time we had this, how to keep the classroom cool. I think I mentioned that, we do surveys at the end of all of these groups, and we respond back the next time saying what some of the students either said was really great or some of the questions that we have, and we address it at the very next meeting. And then when I read these surveys, and I've shared these with Christine and Ed, I am always struck by how, hungry and appreciative students really are, because, I have this feeling, and, I guess it depends on how comfortable you are with being a teacher, with being in front of the classroom, but I always feel very intimidated by these young people that I think, oh my God, they're looking at me like, what does that old woman have to say to relate to me, But when I read the statements from students, it's really heartwarming. They really want to learn. They really look up to you. And I think, one of the faculty members said to me that I had a meeting with the student afterwards, and I said to him, I think you should move from the back of the room to the front of the room. And, the student really took that to heart and said, oh, somebody cares about me and wants me to sit in the front. And the student, and it was like overnight, the student did bring their name. I think, they really go a long way towards helping improve the climate. And Sarah was saying that some of the other things that we talked about, because I remember the last one, keeping the classroom cool, there was hardly anybody there, but it was such a great conversation. I said to Sarah, I forgot what we were talking about. So I ran back to my office to see if I could find my notes, which I could not, because Sarah reminded me that some of what I talked about was what complaints students have about faculty. And unfortunately, I could not find my notes, but I do remember a couple things, and they're probably not shocking. One of them is that students really don't feel like faculty spends enough time answering their questions, that they don't either use the classroom management, but if there are genuine questions, that there should be some space for students to ask questions, because that's another way of showing that you really care about students. And I think basically the most common complaints are all along the spectrum of, not being accessible. And I know that faculty are very accessible, there would be a lot of time that would go into this, but any way that you could show, either by encouraging the use of your office hours or, just reaching out to students in that way, I think it goes a really long way.
Thanks, Laura. I know one thing that came up was sarcasm.
Sarcasm, yes.
And that there was a shocking number of students saying that they felt like most of their faculty were sarcastic. And I was like, wow.
Yeah. But they're in a different position, right? It's not peer-to-peer sarcasm. So
There's a power
again,
issue.
to think about yourself as an authority, and the kind of power that you actually wield in the classroom, I think is very important to remember because, you've grown into yourself. You forgot who you were a long time ago, right?
Great. So we're going to end with a question just kind of for all the panelists. And this really relates to the earlier panel on well-being. Some of the things that we're talking about students sharing things with us, I think, at points there can be moments where we don't feel particularly cool, and then we're still teaching the class, as Professor DeSanto spoke about earlier, or if it's something they're sharing with us in office hours. And this happened to me last fall where a student just sort of unloaded what's going on in her life because I just kept asking hey, is everything okay? Do you want to stop by? And then she told me what was going on and I was not quite prepared to hear it. And I had been a caseworker before, it was a story. And so, I think for us as well, we need those soft places to land, as Professor Flemister was saying. And, I see some relatively new faces. If you've been at the college 5 years or less, raise your hand. Wow. Right, so thinking very quantitatively, that was about my guesstimate. But, certainly you might hear things, and I taught before I came here. I had some teaching under my belt, but, 11 years in, this woman's story was something that, wow, and of course, because I've been here enough time, I knew right away where to send her, and I knew specifically who I could call, and instead of just telling her where to go, I walked her, and I introduced her, and then it was up to her to continue contact, right? But because of the issue she was having, she had lots of people she was already in contact with, multiple court cases, children and family services, you name it. She had all kinds of stuff going on outside. And so, at that point, I was like, I can't say anything, right? It was so confidential. After doing the steps, it was like, I needed someone to talk to, right? And so, I think there's a real bridge between what we've been talking about all day about just kind of, being as good as we want to be to our students, but then also being good to ourselves, so that we can continue to show up in a way that serves our students and doesn't burn us out. And so maybe if each panelist just briefly wants to talk about, along this huge spectrum of kind of issues we've discussed, what you personally do to keep it.
So I think self-care is extremely important, and if you're not taking care of yourself, you're really not there to take care or help other folks. So if your mind and you're somewhere else because of everything else that you're doing outside of the classroom comes into the classroom, it's really difficult to perform at your maximum capability. So I think it's important to take care of yourself, whether that's exercise, whether that's healthy nutrition, whether that's meditation and mindfulness. Maybe that's taking a walk, maybe that's listening to music. Everyone has different things that they do. I just recommend not doing the unhealthy ones too much. Too many cookies and donuts or alcoholic beverages might be a problem. So you want to be cognizant of that. But I think self-care is extremely important. I think that I've had students as well that have kind of blown my mind, and I was like, wow, and I kept that goes home with you. You can't just shut it down. And I think what's important is really to have build a support system around you of colleagues that you can speak to, that have experience, that you can share that information with, and they can kind of help guide you and support you. And as Sarah mentioned, she went out and she found some help to really get these folks with the type of support that they need, because we are limited as to what we can really do. So I think that's really important. And just be aware that if you're I come home and my 2 kids are super energetic when I get home, and if I had a bad day, I'm just like, I need some space. So I'll sit in the car for a couple minutes before I go inside because I know what I'm getting into, right? So be aware of that, but also be aware of your behavior. If you're starting to see that you are becoming a little bit more agitated, do a little reflection as to why, and maybe that was because you had a rough day at work, and or students, issue became your issue. So it's really important to balance that out and just always pay attention to yourself.
I agree with you, Fabian. I think self-care is so important, but also just knowing your resources and not being afraid to ask for help. I think a lot of people, even in your job in general, we don't know the answers and we're afraid to ask someone for the answers. But when we work collectively together, we find better resolutions to help not only the classroom setting, but just the whole community in general.
I have nothing new to add to that. I would have to say that it's a work in progress for me to let go of stress. I've been here, how long have I been here? Since 10 years, I'm close to. I'm still working on that, but I do have to say that developing good relationships with the people that you most closely work with is very important. If I didn't have a really great team to bounce ideas off of and struggle together and really work well together and be able to share things, it would just be I wouldn't be able to go on.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with the rest of the panel. It's just reaching out to the resources on campus. Don't hold on anything to just to yourself. Just to because I believe in real life stories, right? I mean, I remember a faculty member who reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have this student who is here from another country, is suffering, is homesick, is having a hard time with all of the course material, and just said to me the other day that she's thinking about ending it all." And he was kind of walking around for 2 or 3 days with this, and he reached out finally to me, and I said, "Look, go back to the student, because you don't want to break that confidentiality either, right? You want to respect them and say, hey, there's some great resources on campus. There's some fabulous people here. Other students are going or have gone through what you've gone through. Is it okay if I reach out to someone else to help you?" And the student said to him, "Yes." And so then that person that was going to help wasn't me, but I contacted him, and I immediately called Fabian and Dean Gomez and said, "Hey, this is the person." And so together as a team, that team approach, we got that student over to see some folks, and like the next semester, the student was doing great. She was happy. She came by. She was thanking everyone. And so again, the same sentiment is just basically reach out to other people, talk to others. Don't try to do it all alone.
Yeah, perfect. And now we'll open up to Q&A. We'll go Chris and then me.
That actually does lead into my question. I mean, I completely understand that we want to maintain students' confidentiality as much as possible. Are there times when we are obligated not to do so? Are there times when we are obligated to do something other than respect the student's wishes to remain confidential?
And I always, when I meet a student, that's the first thing I talk to them about is the confidentiality, and also the reasons I would break confidentiality. And that's always, are they a threat to themselves? Are they a threat to other people? Or are there other children that are in danger? So those are the 3 elements that I always think about. So someone said, well, what if they're in a domestic violence situation and they don't want to disclose? Well, we can't really do much there, unless we know that, there's some real super danger there. That's one of those things that are a little tricky. But if they're a threat to themselves, they're suicidal, they're helpless, break their confidentiality. And I'll tell every student that's the first thing I say to them after, we kind of build a little bit of rapport in the beginning. I let them know before they start telling me things.
Great. Linda?
Yeah, it was just a little bit of an extension of your question, Chris. So, Stephen, you mentioned that these 3 situations when you would break confidentiality is if the person was a threat to themselves, someone else, or if there were children who were somehow threatened. But what if it's not the individual who's talking to you who is the threat, right? What if it's someone else is a threat to themselves or someone else, but they're telling you that?
So if they're telling you that another student is, or someone else is
someone in their life
is threatening them?
Maybe.
Oh.
I mean, you mentioned the domestic violence situation.
Right. So yeah, so like for example, anything domestic violence related, please, try to encourage them to come see me and come to my office. Also, they can connect with public safety and the chief, and he does a really great job. We work collaboratively on all of those cases. What I like to do with students that are presenting those situations, I encourage them to come and sit down with me. And it's just a meeting, and I'm not gonna, tell them what to do, and I'm not gonna push them to go any which way. What I do with those cases is I encourage them to, let me know what's going on, and it might be a family member that's going through it, and I provide them with information and resources, and I encourage them to follow up. I might follow up with a check-in and say, hey, was this helpful at all or not? At the end of the day, it's really their decision on what they want to do.
So you would not break the confidentiality?
No, not unless I know that somebody's in, their life is in danger. But if they're telling me that they're, let's say, mothers in a domestic violence relationship, and it's hard for them to kind of focus, and so I would help them help their mother or father get that support that they need, and that's what I'll work with them with. Really teach them how to engage their family member into help. And also let them know what their rights are, because I think that's important for people. There's a lot of misinformation, especially in the immigration communities, where people use that as a way to intimidate, and they're unaware that they have a lot more rights than they might have thought they had. So I use that as an educational opportunity. But yeah, that's where I would go with that. I don't know if the chief has anything else.
Yeah, I wanted to say that just to let people know that there are services on campus that might be able to provide them with information that might be helpful. I've actually met with students who had similar situations, and as Victor said, look, these are your rights, and this is where you can ask or tell your mom to go, or your family member, and provide them some external resources they can use. Now, it has to do with them. Again, you're asking permission. You're saying, there are people here on campus who have dealt with this for many years. They can help you. If it's okay, I can, or give you their number, or you can reach out to them on your own. Something that a lot of people don't know, and we like to let people know, is that when we do get incidents like this of domestic violence, we have a program in Coast Safety Office, and we'll actually go with you to the court. If you have to go to the court, you can order protection. We will send a uniformed officer with you. It's very intimidating. So we will escort you. It doesn't matter what borough you live in. We will go with you. And when we walk in, the officer says, I'm here with this person. And they need help. And this is what they need. So we stay with you through that process. It might be an order of protection that you need to get. So it's like having a friend come with you. And then we take you home at the end of the process. Once we get that order of protection, we activate it here on campus. So that they know, and we can get a picture of the assailant or the aggressor, so that they know when you're here, you're really going to be safe, because we're going to make sure this person doesn't come to the campus to try to interfere with what you're trying to do here.
We finished with the minute. Oh, Cynthia.
I just wanted to really commend all of you, because this college really does work very hard to serve our students. And I just wanted to share that I've known Chief Bernabe since he first entered the college. And we have a very, very rich relationship. And 2 semesters ago, I was very concerned about one of my students. And for the first time, I lost some sleep thinking about this student. And I kept trying to figure out how I could help this student. And Ray was the one I went to, and he was able to help me and to work with me. The student did drop out, but I ran into the student the other day, and he said he's trying to get back in the college. And he said he finally recognized how much this college cared about him. So I just wanted to say thank you to all.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to close the panel. So please thank our panelists. And